Hello and welcome to Scream Scene, the horror movie podcast where we watch every horror movie ever made in chronological order and then we rank them from best to worst. My name's Sarah.
And I'm Ben.
Thank you for listening to us today. Ben, it's the most wonderful time of the year.
That's right. It's October. Spooky month. How are you feeling?
Stressed?
Oh no.
It's fine. How are you?
I'm okay for the most part. Yeah, I got a lot going on, but I feel good about it.
Oh, well, that's good. We have the results of our horror adjacent bonus episode movie for October, and it's going to be on the adventures of Ichabod Crane and Mr. Toad.
Yeah, I mean, mostly it's for the Ichabod Crane part, right? The
yeah,
Sleepy
but
Hollow
the
part.
movie is all of it.
Yes.
So we gotta watch all of it, Ben.
Fair.
As much
fair.
as I, would love to skip Mr. Toad being a total ass.
Yeah, I mean, they did do, I think, a thing in the 60s where they split them into two different shorter things for like TV. So we could just watch The Legend of Sleepy Hollow without the Mr. Toad stuff. But we're going to do it with the Mr. Toad stuff because
That's what everyone voted on.
I want listeners to hear how angry it gets you. I especially want, people who really love The Wind in the Willows to hear how angry Mr. Toad gets you.
It's just a difference in what I find funny and enjoyable to engage with. No, it'll be fun. So that will be our October's bonus episode is on, but of course for spooky season we have a whole chock full of fun special material going up on our Patreon. So if you want to get in on that spooky content, head on over to patreon.com/screamscenepodcast. But enough of a shameless plug. Ben, what are we watching today?
Well, Sarah, today we are watching YOTSUYA KAIDAN from 1959, directed by Kenji Misumi. And it's been a trek to get here for me.
Yeah, tell me.
Yeah, so we were going to watch Kaiden Kagami Gifuchi, directed by Masaki Mori, but I was unable to find a watchable copy of it. It was on YouTube, and then the channel that had it up was taken down, and I've been just unable to find any other copies of it. It was another horror film from Shin Toho, the studio that's been releasing Nobuo Nakagawa's horror films. Masaki Mori, who directed it, had directed the 1956 version of YOTSUYA KAIDAN, which we have on the list. And it's a fairly typical, traditional Japanese ghost story with a soap opera-like collection of characters. There's a wronged woman who's killed and dumped into Kagami Pond, and then she returns as a ghost to haunt her killer by appearing and causing him to, hallucinate and, kill the wrong people because he sees the ghost. By all accounts, a fairly standard B-movie of its type,
And very similar plot beats to YOTSUYA KAIDAN.
Right, but also very similar plot beats to Kaiden Kasami Gifuchi by Nobuo Nakagawa. Just these are familiar Japanese ghost story beats, really.
Yeah.
So with that kind of unavailable to us, we move on to this week's film, which also posed some difficulties for me because it took me a while to find subtitles for it. The subtitles that we are watching with, I found and have applied to the film, and they seem fine, but there might be some wonkiness here and there.
You were telling me they were Hungarian subtitles?
Yes, the only subtitles I could find available for this movie were Hungarian, so I translated them to English using Google Translate, and I gave them a skim read, and they seem to have come out all right, because, Google Translate wasn't having to translate on the fly.
Sure.
But still, if there's any wonkiness, that's going to be why. Now, this is the very first color adaptation of YOTSUYA Kaiden, and it's in widescreen too. But it's certainly not, by any stretch, the first movie adaptation of YOTSUYA Kaiden. It's not even the first movie adaptation of YOTSUYA Kaiden that we've watched for this show.
Yeah.
YOTSUYA Kaiden has a long history. So, as is your Sisyphean task, why don't you tell us about YOTSUYA Kaiden, Sarah?
Well, if folks want the full story, they can go listen to our episode on the 1949 adaptation, where I give like a pretty in-depth history of the play and, kabuki itself and that sort of thing. That is episode 153. But the original YOTSUYA Kaiden play was written by Tsuraya Naboku IV, who typically used supernatural and macabre elements to explore domestic themes and stories. He wrote around 120 plays, with 1825's Tokaido YOTSUYA Kaiden being one of his most popular. Now, kabuki, if you aren't familiar, is very melodramatic, has a flair for drama and theatrics and the performance part of theater, and it was often performed as like a full day program with there's 3 different genres of kabuki, and that different material would kind of be interchanged through the day. YOTSUYA Kaiden in particular was performed and intercut with another play called 47 Ronin, and they are both very long, so it was performed over 2 days.
Yeah, so you got half of 47 Ronin and then half of YOTSUYA Kaiden on day 1, and then the back half of both alternated on day 2?
Correct. But you would actually start with YOTSUYA Kaiden.
Oh, okay.
And the reason why that's particularly interesting is because Kaiden, as a Japanese ghost story structure and format, is very focused on karma and people getting their comeuppance. And this play focuses on a couple of Ronin getting their comeuppance because they're real douchebags. Whereas 47 Ronin, on the other side, is about these Ronin, being, heroes in their own right and, regaining their honor and that sort of thing.
Yeah, they're getting revenge for their former master.
Yes. So YOTSUYA Kaiden, especially as first being performed in 1825, being incredibly popular, it's been adapted many, many times, but there are specific scenes and moments that have to be there. Things like a door with blood on it floating in the river, a guy going fishing, a woman brushing her hair. These are things that you need to have in any of your adaptations, but they can be remixed with different emphases. What leads you to those moments can change a little bit, but at the core, a lot of what YOTSUYA Kaiden are those moments.
Yeah, I would say every adaptation of YOTSUYA Kaiden we've seen has shifted up the characters and the motivations and the exactly how we get from A to B's quite a bit. We haven't seen anything that's perfectly adapted the play yet, but there's always those key moments.
Yeah. So in the original play, we follow a Ronin whose name is Yaemon, and he is married to Oiwa. Now, things are very complicated in the original plays, so as much as I've tried to condense for time and brevity, it is still a lot to go through. So Yaemon is married to Oiwa, but she's unhappy, so her dad goes to Yaemon to be like, hey, maybe you guys should divorce. Yaemon doesn't like this and kills Oiwa's father in a rage. At that same time, a Ronin named Nasuke is in love with Oiwa's sister, Asode, who works in a brothel. Asode, her husband, Yomosuchi, mocks Nasuke, and in a rage, Nasuke goes to kill, someone who kind of bumps into him in the night, who ends up being his former master. So Nasuke and Yaemon basically team up with each other for alibis, as well as to be like, yeah, we're going to go get revenge on the people who killed my father-in-law and my former master. Meanwhile, there's this other girl named Ume. She's the daughter of a rich family, and she loves Yaemon, but she thinks she's not as pretty as Oiwa, so she sends poisonous face cream to Oiwa, which disfigures her, causes her to have disfigured face, lose her hair, that sort of thing. In order to divorce Oiwa, Yaemin needs some kind of reason to divorce her. So he goes to the brothel owner and asks him to rape Oiwa to give him a reason to ask for a divorce. So the brothel guy goes to do that, but then is overcome with sympathy for her disfigurement. In that sympathy, he holds up a mirror, and Oiwa realizes Yaemin's setup and basically grabs a gun, grabs a sword to go and kill Yaemin. But she and the brothel owner struggle, and she ends up getting killed herself and slitting her own throat. But Yaemin now gets to be engaged to Ume. However, he is being haunted by Oiwa's vengeful ghost, leading him to basically kill Ume and her father on the wedding night, including the whole fucking family. Naosuke sees this and does try to blackmail Yaemin, basically because he's looking for a document that would allow him to marry Isode, who is Oiwa's sister, to, bring your memory back to it. It's at that moment that we get that intermission and cut to 47 Ronin. For the second half of the play, Naosuke is trying to get with Isode, and Isode keeps saying no, we can't, but not saying why. Her ex-husband at this point, Yomotsuchi, catches Isode and Naosuke together and accuses Isode of adultery. With that dishonor, she ends up killing herself, but not before telling Naosuke that actually they're siblings, and that's why she didn't want to bone down. And Naosuke, with that kind of guilt and shame and disgust over himself, kills himself. Yaemin, meanwhile, continues to be hunted by Oiwa and is wandering in the mountains, driven mad, and Yomotsuchi, who was Isode's husband, finds Yaemin and basically kills him out of pity. And that's the end.
Right. And I'm thinking of the various adaptations we've seen and going well, what about this part of the story? And then realizing it's changed over the course of the adaptations.
Yes, many things have changed. So the first adaptation we saw was in 1949, and it was long.
Yes.
And even then they had to leave stuff out because it's not a 2-day performance of a kabuki play,
Yeah.
So in this 1949 adaptation, it was directed by Keisuke Kinoshita, and it was kind of more of a realistic drama rather than anything to do with supernatural elements. Basically, it's all in Yaemin's head. It's also very much toned down in terms of its theatrics, and my theory to that is by 1949, kabuki had lost popularity due to politics going on in Japan. And so the story's adaptation kind of reflects this and focuses more on tragedy rather than a shock and spectacle. Here is the 1949's adaptation's plot. Mm-hmm. Notably, I want to point out that Oiwa and Isode, who are the sisters, are played by the same actress. Naosuke and Kohei are in jail, but they get out due to foiling someone's escape plan. So they get early release. And Kohei is okay, now that I'm out, I'm going to go find Oiwa because I'm deeply in love with her. Oiwa has since married a guy named Yaemin. Ume is here. She is the daughter of a rich family, and she gets rescued by Yaemin for reasons I won't get into, and basically falls in love with him. Naosuke is getting in with Ume's maid, Omaki, and together they conspire to try to get Ume and Yaemin together. Eventually, Yaemin, who is kind of a fumbling, can't decide what to do kind of person, goes okay, I'll figure out a way to divorce Oiwa. Naosuke does give Yaemin some poison, but he can't bring himself to use it. During an argument that Yaemin has with Oiwa, though, she falls face first into boiling water. Naosuke comes by with an ointment supposed to help heal, but it actually makes the disfigurement worse. And ultimately, Yaemin decides to give her the poison tea because he's
he pities her.
He pities her completely. And it's an excruciatingly painful death that she experiences. Now, Naosuke is calming Yaemin down after having done this, and Kohei, remember Kohei back from jail? He overhears and tries to blackmail, so he gets killed. So Yaemin and Ome get together, but guilt plagues him, and he keeps thinking he sees and hears Oiwa following him around. Now, Asode, who is Oiwa's sister, finds out about the whole plan, and she's Oiwa's twin. So she puts on some of her old clothes and goes and haunts Yaemin a little bit. And in kind of the climax, Yaemin also learns that Naosuke was the reason for Yaemin being a masterless samurai in the first place, because of like something that happened like 7 years ago and led to all of the misfortune and poverty that he and Oiwa were in the first place. And so Yaemin kills Naosuke, and in that fight, the entire house gets set on fire, and Yaemin sees Oiwa in the fire and basically just like accepts his fate, gets burned up, and his last words are, "Forgive me." Now, Naosuke's dead, but Ume and her family are alive and have escaped the fire. Ume, however, does have disfigurement from the burns. And that's the 1949 adaptation.
It's a good movie. I really liked it.
Ultimately, we determined it was not horror because the haunting, it was all kind of in Yaemin's head, and it was very
psychological.
Like, yeah, and it also wasn't like very scary. Like the focus wasn't on horror or being scared. It was about the tragedy of everything.
Yeah, it was more like in the same way that like Macbeth has witches in it, but like Macbeth is not a horror story. You know what I mean?
Well, from some people's point of view. But yeah, so if you want to hear more about the 1949 adaptation, you can listen to episode 153. Our second YOTSUYA KAIDAN movie on the show was the 1956 adaptation, so 7 years later, and this was done by Masaki Mori. If you want to hear more about that version, you can listen to episode 191. In the 1956 movie, we have a mom named Maki setting her son Yaemin up with Ume because she's from a rich family. But oops, Yaemin's already married to Oiwa. Turns out that marriage is because Yaemin killed Oiwa's dad and married her out of guilt. Oiwa doesn't know about any of this. Naosuke was the only witness to the murder of Oiwa's dad, so he continually blackmails Yaemin. Now, Naosuke and Maki con to try to get Yaemin to dump Oiwa, and this will work out in Naosuke's favor because, hey, he'll have more money for me to blackmail him for, by getting a masseuse to rape her. And as an extra piece of, bonus awful, Maki gets some poison for Oiwa. The poison takes effect just as Oiwa is fighting off her rapist, and the guy basically ends up spilling the plan. Oiwa, in a rage, grabs a nearby razor to go and try to kill Yaemin, and in the struggle with her rapist, she slits her own throat and dies. Now the rapist goes to Yaemin for blackmail, and they kill him. The main theme in these stories is don't blackmail killers.
Yeah.
So Yaemin and Ume get together, but Yaemin is continually haunted, thinking he sees Oiwa, and a lot of the haunting is like blood in the wall and like spooky like lights and apparitions, and particularly Oiwa, her apparition appearing where Ume is standing. And so when Yaemin goes to try to destroy Oiwa's ghost, he ends up killing Ume. He also ends up killing her dad because of that same kind of haunting. So Yaemin and his mom Maki escape from the city and head to a Buddhist temple. Meanwhile, Naosuke is with Oiwa's sister Asode. They're also on the run. She finds Oiwa's comb in like the nearby swamp and confronts Naosuke, and he's like, "Oh yeah, no, totally didn't help kill your sister, no." And Naosuke basically gets killed by Asode, but also Oiwa's apparition over top of Asode. So he dies. Meanwhile, at the temple, Yaemin confronts Maki basically for being the reason why he has any problems at all in life, and he kills her in a rage. Again, this is compounded by the haunting. And the priest that's there at the temple tries to get a group of people to restrain Yaman, to be like, stop murdering people. But he, is fully mad by this point, and he dies in the fight with this group. And that's the end.
So it's really interesting the way that you can see, like, just with the 3 plot summaries you've given, like the same basic beats, but with, characters and specifics getting remixed, as you said.
Absolutely. The same names pop up and they're just like placed to different people. And what is particularly interesting is, again, the emphasis. The 1949 movie we determined was not horror. 1956 we determined was absolutely horror, both in the effects of the haunting, the disfigurement of everyone, and yeah, absolutely in the way that it was focused on the horror rather than the tragedy of this story. We did note that it was kind of like 50-50 melodrama and horror, but once it slides into horror, it stays there and doesn't try to cushion the effect on the audience at all.
For sure.
If you want to hear more about the 1956 adaptation, that's episode 191. And like I said, we ranked it. It was considered horror, and it's ranked at number 151 out of 245, which means it's like in the 60% range. So like that's pretty good. That's pretty good. We particularly liked that Asode and Oiwa both get revenge in some sort of method, and we noted that the kabuki influence was back in here. It wasn't like full-on kabuki, but you could see it with like the makeup, the flair of the supernatural. Like you could see the influences being brought back in here.
Yeah, so, there are certain like through lines to these characters, right? Like Yaman sucks, and Naosuke's like a bastard, and all this kind of stuff. But there's different emphases on like who exactly is the most responsible, and how much is Yaman like pushed into doing what he's doing. Because I think in the original play, like Yaman just is terrible. In the 1949 version, he is very much like a weak person who's caught in a difficult situation and is easily manipulated. And then in the 1956 version, he's like really just like pushed into everything by like his mom and Naosuke. So different levels of like accountability for the murder and all the other various crimes. And I bring that up because that's one of the major distinguishing factors of this version of YOTSUYA KAIDAN. So this rendition of the film, as I mentioned earlier, is the first color adaptation of YOTSUYA KAIDAN. It's the first widescreen YOTSUYA KAIDAN. It was a major prestige production coming from Daiei Films, which was one of the major studios of post-war Japan. Producer Masaichi Nagata founded Daiei as a merger of 3 previously existing studios in 1942. In 1950, Daiei produced Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon and entered that film in the Venice Film Festival, where it won the Golden Lion Award before winning the Best Foreign Film Award at the Academy Awards in 1952, and kind of put Japanese film on the map. Tenosuke Kinagasa, who directed Page of Madness way back in the day, directed the film Gate of Hell for Daiei in 1953, which would be the first Japanese film in color to be released internationally, and it won the Palme d'Or at Cannes and Best Foreign Language Film at the Academy Awards. So, like, Daiei was kind of a big deal in the 1950s. They also produced the acclaimed films of director Kenji Mizoguchi, such as 1954's Sancho the Bailiff. This film was directed by Kenji Misumi, who was born in 1921 in Kyoto to a businessman and a geisha, and was raised by his aunt with financial support from his absent father. However, when he told his father that he wanted to make sword fighting movies instead of going to business school, his father cut off all contact with him. Thanks to a recommendation from a novelist friend, he was able to gain employment at Nekatsu Studios in 1941 as a trainee assistant director. But then he was drafted into the war, where he spent 2.5 years as a Russian prisoner of war in Siberia. After that, he returned to Japan to find that Nikkatsu had merged with 2 other studios to form Daiei Films. He began working for Daiei as an assistant director in 1948. As an assistant director, he worked on Gate of Hell and became friends with Tenosuke Kinugasa, who recommended to Daiei that they promote him to director. Misumi's first film was about a one-eyed, one-armed samurai, and from there he began pumping out about 4 films a year.
That's not bad.
By the end of the 1950s, he had risen considerably at Daiei, and in 1961 he directed the first 70mm Japanese film, Buddha. Daiei wanted to keep assigning prestige films to Misumi, but Misumi really just wanted to direct sword fighting movies.
Don't we all?
From 1962 to 1970, which was when Daiei went bankrupt, Misumi directed 6 films in the Zatoichi series, starting with the first film, and then also the 8th, 12th, 17th, 19th, and 21st entries in the series.
So he got his wish.
Yeah. And then, beginning in 1972, he directed the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 5th films in the 6-film Lone Wolf and Cub series, which is way more violent than Zatoichi.
Yeah. No, that's great. I'm glad he finally got to do what he always wanted.
Yeah. Lone Wolf and Cub, by the way, starred Tomisaburo Wakayama, the older brother of Shintaro Katsu, who played Zatoichi, and we saw Wakayama as Yemen in the 1956 version of YOTSUYA KAIDAN. Kenji Misumi's final film was, appropriately enough, The Last Samurai in 1974. Writer Fuji Yahiro, who was known for Sancho the Bailiff and later Buddha in 1961, creates a version of YOTSUYA KAIDAN that veers far afield from the version of the story that most Japanese people would be familiar with, in creating perhaps the most sympathetic portrayal of Yemen we have yet seen. The reason for this is most likely due to the actor chosen to portray the character, Kazuo Hasegawa. Born in 1908 in Kyoto to a sake brewing family, Hasegawa first acted in a play at the age of 5, and from there he became a kabuki performer being trained as an onagata, which is a, actor who plays female parts.
Yeah.
In the 1920s, onagata sort of stopped being a thing due to changing style in Japanese acting. And in 1927, he made his film debut for Shochiku Studios under the name Chojiro Hayashi, where he became a major star in the period dramas of Tenosuke Kinugasa due to his good looks and graceful movements. In the next 10 years, he appeared in 120 films for Shochiku before moving to Toho in 1937. As a response to him switching studios, Shochiku sent armed thugs after him who slashed his face up with razor blades.
What the fuck?
He recovered and acted for Toho under his real name of Kazuo Hasegawa, sort of considering Chojiro Hayashi to be dead. He moved to Daiei in 1950, where he starred in the popular Zenigata Heiji series, where he plays a policeman in Edo period Japan who solves crimes and stuff. He also starred in The Tale of Genji in 1951, Gate of Hell in 1953, Story from Chikamatsu in 1954, an adaptation of The 47 Ronin in 1958, which was written by Fuji Yahiro, who wrote this version of YOTSUYA KAIDAN, and his 300th film in 1963 was a remake of An Actor's Revenge, which he had appeared in for Shochiku way back in 1935 in the same role. He retired from acting shortly thereafter and passed away in 1984.
Cool guy.
So Hasegawa was a popular, respected, handsome leading man known for playing heroic roles. And so most commentators supposed that the softening of Yemen's character in this film was done so as to not push Hasegawa too far from what audiences would expect of him. 27-year-old actress Yasuko Nakata was romantically involved with Daiei's president, Masaichi Nagata, when she was cast as Oiwa in this film. Nagata was 27 years older than her.
Oh.
After the two split in 1964, she retired from acting. She does not perform a dual role in this film. Ume is played by Yoko Uraji, and Asode is played by Mieko Kondo. This version of YOTSUYA Kaiden was released by Daiei on July 1st, 1959. It's traditional for Japanese horror films to come out in summer because the idea is they're supposed to send a chill down your spine to give you relief from the heat.
Okay.
10 days later, Shochiku released a cheaper, shorter, more garish, and more horror-centric adaptation of YOTSUYA Kaiden from director Nobuo Nakagawa. And that version, which is called Tokaido YOTSUYA Kaiden, would become the definitive feature film version of the story. As a result, this version is often overlooked, and it's very difficult to find.
Yeah, well, same year, practically same title.
Yeah. So this forgotten status, plus its unique treatment of the Yaemin character, has earned this version some praise in a hipster cred.
Oh, is this the Japanese
kind of
Spanish
way?
Dracula?
Maybe. We'll find out when we watch it. But yeah, there's sort of Kenji Misumi's YOTSUYA Kaiden is the one you should really watch kind of thing with this version. But of course, we'll be checking out Nobuo Nakagawa's in our next episode, so we'll be able to very directly compare them.
All right. Well, folks, hopefully you can find a copy of this YOTSUYA Kaiden to watch along. You're going to hear a brief musical interlude, and when we come back, we will discuss YOTSUYA Kaiden from 1959, directed by Kenji Misumi.
See you on the other side, everybody. Welcome back, everybody. We just finished watching YOTSUYA Kaiden from 1959, directed by Kenji Misumi. Sarah, what did you think of this go-round?
Man, this movie took way too long to do anything.
Well, okay. This is, I think, one of the problems with using YOTSUYA Kaiden as a basis for a horror movie, which is that the setup can take a long time depending on what the director has chosen to take from the play. Because you've got to get all of these characters and motivations in the right spot for the crucial events to happen.
This is too much to have to do.
I think, honestly, that the script of this version is a pretty good simplification of the storyline, and yet it still takes 55 minutes for us to get to the part where Oiwa's face gets fucked up in this 86-minute movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So 3/4 of the movie. Yeah, it's... Yeah. Let me give the plot,
Sure.
and then we'll dive in. So, same basic setup with Yaemin. He's a Ronin. He's making umbrellas in poverty, and he's married to Oiwa. Now, they do have a servant named Kohei, who's been their servant for 24 years.
The impression I got was that he was a servant in Oiwa's family, which in this version is the Tamiya family, which is a higher rank family that Yaemin married into. And then when that marriage happened, Kohei went with Oiwa to Yaemin's household, and now he's stuck as their servant.
Yeah, but he looks like he's 25.
Yes.
You know? That's the problem.
Yes, absolutely.
So we have Naosuke and two probably named buddies, but not in our version.
They were given names in this version, but I don't remember one of them. It's Akiyama and S something, like Sakuji or something like that. It doesn't really matter.
I will be referring to them as the two buddies.
Yeah.
Naosuke and the two buddies are always getting into scrapes and having Yaemin come save their butts with his sword skills. Now, Oriwa's uncle comes by and he's like, how's searching for a job, Yaemin? And Yaemin's like, I gave up on that because it's shitty out there. And Oriwa's uncle is like, nobody wants to work anymore. Let me set up an interview between the prestigious Ito family and you. And you can bring this keg of sake as like, not a bribe, but just like a little gift.
Yeah.
To which Yaemin is practically laughed out of the Ito residence as a result. So he's like off to a bar, drinking in solitude, feeling sorry for himself, when suddenly this like lovely young lady and her maid are like seeking refuge because they keep being chased and harassed by drunks. Now these drunks are like from like high-ranking families, so no one's going to stand up for them except for Yaemin, the most like backbone stand-up person in this movie apparently.
It's weird because he's standing up for them less because it's the right thing to do and more because it just kind of like spills into his room. Like it's a very man with no namey kind of like, well, now you've made it my problem kind of thing.
Yeah. So anyways, he protects them. And this woman, her name is Ume, she just falls madly in love with Yaemin at this point. Turns out she's also the daughter of the Ito family, like his only daughter. Put a pin in that. We do have the Asode Naosuke subplot here, where Naosuke's like, hey, Asode, want to get with a winner? And Asode's like, fuck you. And Naosuke needs to learn to take no for an answer.
He never does.
Asode's working at a tea house at the town over, but that's just kind of setting up where she's at for the rest of the movie. Okay, so Naosuke and the two buddies basically arrange for Yaemin and Ume to meet. So, Ume can kind of get to know him a little bit better. And then Ume goes to her dad and she's like, listen, I only want Yaemin and I'm going to kill myself unless I get Yaemin. Her dad's like, he's married. And she's like, I know.
I said what I said.
Exactly. So her dad and the two buds try to come up with a way to basically get Oiwa out of the picture, while Naosuke and Ume's maid Omaki come up with a way to really get Oiwa out of the picture by poisoning some medicine for her. Ito and the two buds come up with a plan for a basically adultery plot where Kohei and Oiwa are actually getting nasty on the side, which isn't the truth until we cut to Kohei being like, Oiwa, I've always loved you, and her being like, fuck off.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's a pretty good frame up because it, has that basis in truth.
Yeah. Now, Yaemin, throughout all of this, is kind of the worst husband. He's always, like, very neglectful of Oiwa, especially because she just had a miscarriage, and he's like, that's women's problems, and I'm not going to talk to you about it. He's always out going fishing, man things.
Right. He's just kind of a jerk.
He's just kind of a jerk, and now he's spending all of his time over at the Ito residence, because it's kind of like his job is like getting paid to play husband with Ume, except for having sex.
Yeah, I mean, he's not having an affair. He's just doing everything.
He's having an emotional affair.
He's doing everything but have an affair. Sure, yeah.
Now, throughout all of this, Oiwa is sick because of the miscarriage, and she needs some special herb, but it's super expensive. So Kohei, after, professing his love, whatever, basically takes Oiwa's fancy comb that she got as a gift from Yaemin, and runs off to sell it to get money to buy the medicine. That's when he is confronted by the two buds who beat him up and then take him over to Yaemin and tell Yaemin about Kohei being in love with Oiwa, and Yaemin's like, fuck this guy, and so they kill him.
Specifically, one of the two buddies kills him.
Yes. Now Yaemin has been out fishing. Naosuke went to Oiwa to give medicine that she thinks is this like fancy medicine that's going to cure all her troubles, but is actually the poison. She takes it and she gets disfigured on her face. It starts out as kind of a bruise, like a really bad black eye that kind of spreads to her temple. But as it kind of progresses, she does lose her hair. It does kind of get bumpy on that side. The classic Oiwa YOTSUYA Kaidan look.
Yeah, I feel like the section of the story from when like Takuetsu the masseur shows up at her place to whenever someone else discovers that she looks terrible is really the same in every adaptation, which like shows how key that scene is, like with her looking in the mirror and combing her hair and all of that stuff.
Absolutely. So, Oiwa, everyone, when they see her, the translation of the subtitles from Hungarian to English translates everyone's reaction to "do not approach."
Yeah.
As she comes closer. But Oiwa does have a tumble with one of the two buds who comes over to kind of be like, no one's going to want you now, which leads to a sword being stuck in the wall, which comes in handy when Yaemin comes in and goes, "Holy shit, Oiwa." And he goes to confront her about the affair, freaks out over her appearance, and then in their struggle, Oiwa falls on the sword and basically cuts her throat. Now, Naosuke and the two buds are like, "Hey, Yaemin, everything's great now. You can just be with Ume." And Yaemin's like kind of shooken up by this, but just kind of like is in a daze, I guess in shock, you could say, as he heads back over to the Ito residence. Before they get there, it turns out that someone looking for Yaemin appears and asks to be entered into the Ito residence. Turns out this mysterious figure is the ghost of Oiwa, and so begins the haunting. We have the classic ghost of Oiwa appearing where someone is, and so when someone slashes out, it ends up killing or hurting someone else, as is the case for Ume. She doesn't get killed, but she definitely gets slashed a bit. After slashing Ume, Yaemin runs off to a Buddhist temple where he is haunted. And at this point, I have to just put a little asterisk here of like, when Oiwa was dying, she's like, "No, Yaemin would never do anything bad to me. It must be the Ito family. Curse the Ito family." And now she's haunting Yaemin? That doesn't make sense in terms of what they're trying to do here with Yaemin not having any fault at all.
Yeah, I mean, Akiyama, who's one of the two buddies, when he's like comes over to be like, and leaves his sword there, he tries to like pin it on Yaemin. Like he's like, "Yeah, it was your husband who did all of this," which is like, he doesn't really have a motivation for doing that other than so that Ghost Oiwa has a reason to haunt Yaemin at first. But ultimately, I think what's happening here is that Ghost Oiwa is haunting Yaemin so that Yaemin will feel guilty enough to become like the instrument of her revenge against the Ito family.
Which is what happens. He takes his sword and he goes to the Ito residence. Now, by this point, Ume's recovering from her injuries. Omaki, her nurse, gets got by one of the two buds thinking he sees Oiwa. And so Yaemin goes and... actually, I'm getting ahead of myself because Asode still has a part to play in this movie. Asode calls over Naosuke because she's figured out like, "Oh, my sister's dead, something's gone wrong." And she tricks Naosuke into confessing about what happened while Yaemin is outside her house. And so Yaemin confronts Naosuke like, "You bastard." Naosuke tries to escape and ends up accidentally getting impaled on bamboo. Gross. Then Yaemin goes to the Ito family and slashes up the two buds, slashes up Father Ito, and then he runs off to go back to the Buddhist temple where he dies of his injuries in front of the Buddhist statue, and a golden light descends upon him as Oiwa's fancy kimono also descends, and therefore happy ending for the two dead lovers.
Yeah. Yaemin dies of like running time disease. Like he dies of end of the movie-itis.
Yeah. Of his injuries.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will say that once the poison takes full effect, effects are good. But I was disappointed when Oiwa's face first appears and it's just bruising, yet everyone is reacting to it like it's the full Oiwa look.
Sure, yeah. There's a lot of people like reacting to this big bruise on her face as if she's like really hideous. And for the most part, the really hideous Oiwa really happens when she's a ghost, like after she's dead. It's weird to me that like over the years, with the various simplifications that the story has gotten, that Oiwa's disfigurement has been simplified to the point where it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah, where, she has to have the bump, she has to have the lack of hair in that area, but how that equates to or results from the poison, or in that other one from the boiling water.
Yeah, like in the play, it's that the Itos give her a gift of a face cream that is toxic. So it's like, cool, that'll mess your face up. In the 1949 version, it's like, yeah, her face gets burned by boiling water. And then later she's given poison in the guise of medicine, and that's what kills her. And then in like the 1956 version, it was just the poison in the guise of medicine, which is what we get here. And it's just like, so wait, why does the poison bruise her face? I can kind of get like her hair falling out maybe, but yeah, it's I think we talked about this a little bit in the discussion of the 1956 version about like wanting to simplify things but still being like so married to the like iconic elements of the story that you can't change, to the point where some of those iconic elements don't really make sense anymore.
It's Baudrillard's curse.
Baudrillard?
Jean Baudrillard is a French sociologist, and I think the best kind of example for like what he was about is like the distancing from like the symbol and its meaning. So pumpkin spice, you have a physical pumpkin, pumpkin, and then it gets turned into pumpkin spice latte. So, a step removed from the original physical pumpkin, the
right.
signifier, right? And then it gets further removed to like, I don't know, like a pumpkin spiced flavored milk you pour into your coffee, where there's no pumpkin, there's no spice, it's all just a simulation of that original thing.
Right.
So no connection to the actual pumpkin itself. Yeah. So that's what I mean when I say Baudrillard's curse.
Got it. Yeah, to the point where like we're so far away from some of these things that we don't seem to remember why they're here.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I do agree that once she's dead and a ghost, I actually really like this version's take on her melty face. And even though it takes a while for the horror to kick in this movie, I do think the last 30 minutes of this movie do have some really cool horror visuals backed up by a very creepy score.
Yeah, her kimono is put into like a bucket of water, and her hand like creepily comes out and it's like super pale and gross looking and is like bothering the masseuse. So I would agree that there is some good imagery here, but 30 minutes is very, very generous. It is 20 minutes.
Well, isn't the movie 86 minutes long? 55 to 86 is 30, right?
Yeah, no, it's after the hour mark.
Okay. Well, regardless, I think that the movie manages to kick it into high gear once we get into the haunting section, even though it takes a long time to get there. The 1956 movie had a similar problem, although I think it made it to the horror stuff earlier in the runtime. But the color cinematography and the widescreen lets this movie like pull off some really cool visuals. One of the other scares I really like is when Yemen's fishing and like the swamp weeds kind of like entangle him and trying to pull free. He ends up like pulling up the door that Oiwa and Kohei's bodies are nailed to, which
is another thing from the play.
Yeah, it's another key aspect of the story, but we don't actually in this version see them get nailed to the door and put downstream. That just kind of gets mentioned as an offhand aside, but it comes back in that haunting.
Yeah, I will say that as far as adaptation of the play goes, this, even with its like bending over backwards for Yemen to not be at fault, I think it's a fairly good adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
I will say though that the bending over backwards for Yemen it really pushes it so far that it affects your like suspension of disbelief.
Sure, a little bit.
It's kind of like, oh yeah, how could Yemen ever have anything bad to do?
Yeah, I think I turned to you at one point during the movie and said that this sounded like the version of the story that Yemen would give as like testimony at his trial, where it's like he's not disputing any of the core facts. It's just that nothing happens to actually be his fault, right?
Yeah.
So we have like he doesn't kill Oiwa in any way. Like Naosuke delivers the poison. Akiyama leaves his sword blade behind for her to fall onto. He doesn't kill Kohei. One of the two buds, I think it's Akiyama again, does that. He, like the worst thing...
He doesn't even kill Ome.
No, he maims her thinking it's Oiwa. And then it's like one of the two buds again who comes in and like sees Oiwa instead of Omaki and like slashes at her. There's just like so much where it's not technically Yemen's fault.
And then when he does have agency, we're on his side because he's taking revenge for Oiwa and like announces so.
Yeah, the first time he ever actually makes a choice in the movie really is to go after the people who are responsible for, Oiwa's death and all of this. Now, that's not to say that like this version of Yemen is like a good guy.
No.
He's still definitely like a jerk. It's just that like he's not even part of the plan. Like it's not even how it is in some of the adaptations where like in some of them Naosuke has to kind of twist his arm to go along with the like kill Oiwa, marry Ume plan, and maybe Yemen makes Naosuke do all the dirty work. Like here he's not really even
He's
aware.
He's just one of the chess pieces being moved about.
Exactly. Everyone's scheming around him and kind of pushing him into stuff that he doesn't want to do. Like ultimately his problem here is that he's a jerk with bad friends and he's too proud to like accept help, which puts him into this precarious position. I will say, however, that what I like about softening Yemen's character in this way is that I think it's an interesting twist on the story to give us an ending where Oiwa's haunting like leads to him purposefully becoming the instrument of her revenge instead of just doing it accidentally. And, it leads us to this ending that sort of is about reconciliation and forgiveness, where like he fights for her and dies, and then we get this imagery that suggests that like her spirit has forgiven him, and that like everything's gonna work out in heaven, whatnot. And I think that's like a decent ending to this story.
Yeah, I would agree.
I do think it's funny that like the way that this version of the story has been designed, like Yemen goes over to the Ito residence, people are getting stabbed and slashed and haunted by ghosts left, right, and center. I really like, as an aside, how this movie does like the effects for like flaming flying light.
Yeah.
Iowa, those were well done. But we basically end up with a situation where all of the Ito like samurai retainers all like attack Yemen, so that we get that like classic Chanbara sword fighting movie ending of like the hero surrounded by a bunch of nameless mooks like slashing people up, which just is really funny when this director goes on to like create the Zatoichi series.
The sword choreography sucks, though. I will just say it feels so slow. It feels so slow
compared to Zatoichi. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is definitely a very primitive stage of the filmmaking that's going to get us those classic samurai movies later.
So I feel like we're ready to move on to ranking, but I wanted to ask you, I wasn't sure if this movie is trying to be horror because its emphasis was so much on like, are we doing a good adaptation? Are we hitting all the points of like the comb and the kimono and all of this, and the haunting happening 3/4 into the movie? Like, is it trying to be horror, or is it just trying to be a haunted drama?
So I'm willing to say this is horror, and the reason why is I think because once the haunting actually starts, Kenji Misumi is doing a lot of really creative horror movie stuff, a lot of creative use of moving camera, a lot of really neat creative ways for Oiwa to pop up. You know, people are getting like pulled by invisible forces. It's honestly some of the best horror content we've seen in YOTSUYA Kaiden so far, because the movie's doing more than just have Oiwa like pop up for a couple of frames for a jump scare or be superimposed over someone else moments before that person is slashed by a sword. Like, there's other stuff happening here, other kinds of haunting. I really like the scene with her and Yemen in the Buddhist temple. I really like just the way the camera moves around her when she's a ghost and the way she's lit. Like, I think there's a focus on the spooks and the scares in that last quarter of the movie that I think makes it applicable to say that this is horror. I also feel like the thing I noticed, and maybe it's because this is the first one we've seen of these in color, but I really noticed the blood throughout this version.
So the title comes up and it's dripping with blood. And then we don't see blood again until Kohei is gripping the comb so tightly that it's like cutting into his hand. And I'm glad you brought this up because this is something I wanted to mention, that, you know, it's not afraid of showing red for blood, but it doesn't use color beyond that.
Yeah, the color is just sort of here.
Yeah.
Oiwa's traditional appearance is a very kind of like black and white appearance, quite honestly.
It's here, and this particularly the blood is here because of Horror of Dracula, but like, so it's like, okay, cool, you've checked off that box, but they aren't going like, oh, well, what can we do with the color then? Mm-hmm. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think the color is being used poorly, but it's certainly like they're not trying to do anything special with it. Mm-hmm. But I did notice blood all throughout this movie once we get into the spooky parts, once we're past the setup.
So where were you looking to rank?
So I have a feeling that I liked this movie a lot more than you did, just kind of judging from the vibes I'm getting. But obviously I started by looking at where the 1956 version of YOTSUYA Kaiden is sitting on the list. That's down at 151. I liked this better than that. They're both pretty standard adaptations of YOTSUYA Kaiden, in my opinion. Obviously, this one has the sympathetic Yemen as like a distinguishing factor, but I think that like the color and widescreen cinematography gives this one an edge. So if I had a choice of which two to watch, I think I'd go with this one. The question is, how much better is it? And where I'm looking is between about 85 and 95, to be honest with you. That kind of range. I honestly am not sure if this is better than like Student of Prague from 1926 or The Black Room from 1935, which I think hit these kind of like, I did a bad thing and now I'm haunted kind of vibes a lot better. But I could probably go for this over watching The Bad Seed again. The Bad Seed is a classic, but it's very over the top. So I don't know. What were you thinking?
So you were right. I was looking lower, particularly because we actually get to the horror faster in the 56 YOTSUYA Kaiden. So I was looking down. I settled around 216, 3 Cases of Murder as my ceiling. And then kind of looking down, I stopped at 224, Frankenstein's Daughter, because it's definitely more competent than that. And the reason I particularly was drawn to 3 Cases of Murder is the balance of how much, or like percentage, I'll say, of how much this movie is horror versus not horror.
Wow, you're looking way lower than me then. Like, I get what you're trying to say, and I get that, like, it's tough to wait that long for the horror, particularly if it's, like, the end of a long day and you're tired and you kind of just want to get the movie over with.
I will say, like, this movie knows that we know the story.
Yes.
And so, like, it does a thing like the masseuse is offering the medicine, the poisoned medicine to Oiwa, and then he's like, oh no, hold on, let me blow on it first.
Yes.
And of course in COVID era, I'm like, don't touch my tea. Why are you blowing on it? All your germs are on it now. But it's trying to like edge you closer and closer. And I'm just like, I know it's going to happen. Just fucking do it. We're past an hour. Why is she not dead yet?
See, I feel like you can have a sustained buildup playing on, that audience expectation and then like use that as a big point of release. But it all comes down to like how good is the stuff once the haunting begins, and like does it deserve that sustained buildup? I really liked this movie once it started to get to horror, and I think that aside from looking at like a percentage game of like how many minutes are there ghosts on screen, kind of with a stopwatch and a notebook.
Listen, I'm in the CinemaSins camp of movie analysis, apparently.
This movie is not as timid about horror as 3 Cases of Murder. Like, it's taking a long time to set everything up, and maybe it's longer than it needs to. But, like, if this was 3 Cases of Murder, this movie would have had, like, Oiwa die off screen, and then, like, I don't know, Yemen would walk down a dark hall and get a shiver and say, oh, maybe there was a ghost over there, perhaps, I don't know. And then that would be the end of the movie. Like, 3 Cases of Murder was embarrassed to have anything that might possibly spook a person in it, whereas Kenji Misumi, like, is trying to do a haunting here.
That's fair.
My range was under the Black Room at 90, but above... Gosh, what even was The Thing That Couldn't Die?
It was The Thing That Couldn't Die, Ben. No, I think that was the dude who was buried on that ranch, and like the girl had like the vibes by the tree.
Okay, yeah. So I think between 90 and 95 is where I'm looking.
Okay, so looking below that, Half Human is at 97. And I will at least admit that YOTSUYA KAIDAN from 1959 has more horror in it, like visceral, in your face, on your face horror, than Half Human.
Oh no, your face. Do not approach.
Do not approach.
I could go, I think, below Quatermass 2 and above The Thing That Couldn't Die.
Okay, we'll make the case.
It's mostly just that, like, I think... Well, I was going to say that I think this is just a better made movie, which should earn it some points. But you are right that the fight choreography is pretty janky. Like, it's just the camera's set up, some guys bump into each other in front of it. And
not to seem like I'm pulling a weird card, but I was looking at 216 to 224.
Yeah. No, totally fair. Yeah, you're like agreeing to be way up here with me, which is, huge.
This is why you wait so long for us to record, isn't it? So I'm dead tired when we get to ranking. And then I just go with whatever you want.
I'm sorry. I really don't mean for it to seem that way.
I'm just ribbing you.
Yeah, okay, let's go with where you had suggested then. So below Night of the Blood Beast, above Half Human?
Yep.
Okay. So that puts this at number 97, YOTSUYA KAIDAN from 1959, directed by Kenji Misumi. Now, next week, we're looking at another YOTSUYA KAIDAN that we can compare to this.
Yeah.
The most famous YOTSUYA KAIDAN.
Gosh, I hope it goes above this.
Yes, I hope so too. Hopefully we can find more to like agree on with that one.
Folks, if you would like to see this list, you can go to our website, screamscenepodcast.com. There you can find links to the many episodes we have mentioned today, as well as our appeals box. If you would like to contest this or any other ranking, you can drop us a line through our Ask Box on Tumblr. You can reach out over email at screamscenepodcast@gmail.com or over Twitter @_screamscene.
Scream Scene updates every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spotify. You can subscribe to the show using our RSS feed, and you can help the show out by telling your friends about us. Word of mouth is the best way for us to grow our audience. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can head on over to patreon.com/screamscenepodcast. Our patrons get access to all kinds of really cool bonus content during October in the lead up to Halloween. So head on over to patreon.com/Scream Scene Podcast and sign up to see all of those goodies.
Well, I mean, I guess you've already said what we're watching next week.
That's true. For those of you wondering what the Tokaido means in Tokaido YOTSUYA Kaiden, I believe Tokaido is just the region that YOTSUYA is located in. So instead of the title of the movie being Ghost Story of YOTSUYA, it's Ghost Story of YOTSUYA in Tokaido, just so we know what that distinction means. But yes, next week we're watching Tokaido YOTSUYA Kaiden, directed by Nobuo Nakagawa.
We will see you then, creatures of the night.
Bye.
Bye.